Today, we're talking about emissions scopes. Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Prince, and I spend my time helping organizations and individuals understand energy and sustainability and the roles that we play to ensure a sustainable energy future. This is DBT, and we're doing big things in energy. Today, we're talking about something that sounds technical at first, but I promise it's very simple once it's broken down. Today, we're talking about emissions scopes. So, what are they and why should you care? Think of the emission scopes as categories or groups that help us understand where pollution is coming from. You see, not all emissions are the same. Some are as a result of things that we can control, while other emissions are hidden in the products we buy and the energy we use. To make sense of it all, emissions were categorized into three scopes. So you've got scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are those emissions that are directly as a consequence of your business operating. So think, what are you burning or using yourself? For example, the fuel in a company's trucks or vans, gas boilers heating an office, or factories releasing smoke during production. These are things that you directly control. If your company drives the truck or owns the boilers, the emissions are yours. Scope 1 emissions are the easiest to monitor, report, and control, so start reducing. By simply swapping diesel trucks for electrical ones or switching to cleaner fuels, you can reduce your scope 1 emissions. Now, let's talk about scope 2. This is all about the energy you buy, like electricity for powering your appliances, heating, and cooling. You might not own the power plant, but if you're plugging into the grid, then you are responsible for a piece of the emissions. So if your office lights run on electricity from a coal power plant, that's scope 2 emissions. If you're in a building with central heating, that also counts as scope 2 emissions. Scope 2 is critical because, especially for businesses in the service sector, this constitutes a significant portion of their carbon footprint. You can cut your scope 2 emissions by buying renewable energy, increasing energy efficiency, so this could be by installing energy efficient lights. And you can also reduce your scope 2 emissions by signing up for green power deals. So think of PPAs, that's power purchase agreements. These are simply agreements where an organization promises or guarantees to buy the green energy. So think PPAs for offshore wind energy, PPAs for solar energy, PPAs for maybe even hydrogen energy when that becomes a thing. PPAs are important because they are one of the means through which renewable energy is made more attractive for investors and producers. And now we'll talk about scope 3 emissions, and this is where it gets tricky, but stay with me. Scope 3 emissions includes all indirect emissions that occur within your value chain, either upstream or downstream. When we talk about upstream, we are talking about your supply chain, so where you're getting your raw materials from. When you talk of downstream, you're talking about service delivery, after production. How do your products get to the final consumer? The emissions that occur within these processes account to your scope 3 emissions as a business. So you see, scope 3 emissions are emissions that are a consequence of your activities, but they are not emitted from sources that are directly owned or controlled by you. Scope 3 emissions can include emissions from business travel, employee flights and car rentals, purchased goods and services. Scope 3 could also include emissions from transportation and distribution, both logistics you hire and those your suppliers use. Waste generated in operation of your sold products, for example, emissions from a car you manufacture when the customer drives it. Also think end-of-life treatment of sold products. For most organizations, scope 3 is the largest, as we can imagine, and was difficult to account for, to report, to manage. You see, understanding scope 3 means looking beyond your own walls. It means thinking about your supply chain, your customers, and the broader ecosystem that you are a part of. The challenge here is that you can't just flip a switch. It means usually working with suppliers and rethinking products. You might even need to change how customers interact with what you sell. You might be wondering, why go through all this trouble of categorizing emissions into scopes 1, scope 2, scope 3? Why do all that? See, first of all, it helps the organization know where the biggest problem is and also the biggest opportunity to reduce emissions. If your scope 2 emissions are high, then you know that you need to invest in renewable energy. If your scope 3 emissions dominate, then you need to work on your suppliers and also rethink your product design. Secondly, many reporting frameworks like the Carbon Disclosure Project require companies to report their emissions by scopes. Investors, customers, and regulators are increasingly demanding transparency in emissions reporting, and not just transparency, but action as well. And finally, understanding the emission scopes for your business. So understanding where your emissions are coming from helps you set real science-based reduction targets, and it helps you demonstrate real leadership in climate action. If we don't know where emissions are coming from, then we can't make a plan to reduce them. We've talked about scope 1 emissions, which are direct emissions, scope 2 emissions, which are indirect emissions resulting from energy purchase, and scope 3 emissions, which are other indirect emissions upstream and downstream of the value chain, which occur as a result of your company's operations but are not emitted from sources that you directly own or control. Let's put this into perspective with real-world examples. The first example that we're going to consider is a coffee shop chain. Scope 1 emissions would be delivery vans and on-site gas ovens. Scope 2 emissions would be purchased electricity to run the coffee machines and the lights. Scope 3 emissions will be those emissions from growing, transporting, and roasting coffee beans, packaging, and also customers commuting to buy coffee. The second example that we're going to consider is a car manufacturer. Their scope 1 emissions would be factory emissions from paint shops and testing engines. Scope 2 emissions would be electricity used for assembly lines and offices, and scope 3 emissions would be metal extraction and parts from suppliers, the fuel burned by vehicles during their entire lifetime, and recycling or disposing of cars at the end of their life. But how do we measure and reduce these emissions? Measuring emissions is not always straightforward, especially scope 3 emissions, but there are standardized methodologies and tools that can help, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISO 14064, and various carbon calculators. Reducing emissions requires a tailored approach for each scope. For scope 1, you can upgrade your equipment, switch to low carbon fuels, and electrify your fleet of vehicles. For scope 2, you could invest in energy efficiency, purchase renewables, or buy green certificates. For scope 3, you could engage your suppliers, design lower impact products, encourage sustainable customer behavior, and consider circular economy strategies. No matter where you start, the key is to measure, manage, and then reduce emissions over time. Understanding emissions is the foundation for taking meaningful climate action, whether you run a multinational business or you run a small company, or you're just an individual trying to make a difference. If you found this video helpful, give it a like, share with your friend, and hit subscribe for more insights on energy and sustainability. And hey, if you want me to dive deeper into any of the emission scopes, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, let me know in the comments. And if you have more insights to share, just drop it in the comments. Let's get the conversation flowing. Until next time, goodbye.